Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to today's seminar series presentation on Peoples of the Annamites with Dr. James Chamberlain. My name is Corey Chimko. I'm the volunteer digital content technician for the Saola Foundation, and I'll be taking care of the technical aspects today. If you have any issues hearing or seeing the presentation, please let me know in the chat, and I will do my best to get things up and running properly. A bit about today's format. The presentation, we expect it to run about 40 minutes or so. We'll be muting everyone for the duration of the talk, but if you have any questions for Jim, please put them in the chat window, which I will be monitoring, and we will have a 15 to 20 minute Q&A session following the presentation. Any questions we don't get to will be forwarded to Jim, and he'll reach out to you via email following the talk. The presentation is being recorded, so if you want to turn off your video, you can do so now. I also recommend you switch to speaker view for the duration of the presentation, which you can do by clicking the view button in the top right corner of the Zoom window and choosing speaker. Finally, we will be sharing the recording via YouTube and saolafoundation.org in the coming days. So watch for that. And now I'd like to hand things over to Bill Robichaud, President of the Saola Foundation, to introduce our speaker today. Bill.
Thanks, Corey, and thanks everybody for coming today. It's really a privilege to have Jim Chamberlain join us and for me to introduce him. Jim is a linguistic anthropologist, and he's one of the world's leading authorities on the Thai-Lao language group. Jim, like me, is a Midwesterner. He hails from Lansing, Michigan, and he did his PhD at the University of Michigan in historical linguistics and cognitive anthropology. But he hasn't been in Michigan much lately. Jim has lived and worked in Laos or Thailand for more than 50 years, since the 1960s. His specialty is in Southeast Asia, it's Southeast Asian ethnozoology. And that is how indigenous people perceive and construct the natural world around them, especially as revealed through language. And he's just absolutely brilliantly insightful in this field. In 1996, just a few years after Saola was discovered in Vietnam, Jim did a one-week ethnographic survey in the Lao Animites in the Khai Nam Thun National Protected Area. This is the area with just 2 years before this, Saola was confirmed to occur in Laos. During this one-week survey, Jim discovered 5 previously undescribed languages and ethnic groups, all endemic to this small area within the Annamites. This was as extraordinary to linguists and anthropologists as the discovery of Saola and large-antlered muntjac and Annamite striped rabbit were to biologists. Jim and I have been friends and colleagues for more than 20 years. I think we've hit it off so well because he's an anthropologist who is very interested in wildlife, and I'm a wildlife conservationist who is very interested in indigenous people and cultures. So we have a great connection. He and I have a favorite French Lao cafe in the heart of Vientiane called Le Banaton. And one of my favorite things to do is to meet Jim there for breakfast or a coffee and talk about the intersections of culture and biodiversity. And I'm just so very pleased to be able to share this opportunity with you today. So Jim, please take it away.
Wow. Thank you very much, Bill. Are we okay, sound-wise? Thank you, Bill, so much for that very flattering introduction. I hope I can live up to your expectations with this presentation today. I think I have to go to share screen, right?
Yep, that's correct.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Okay. In keeping with what Bill just said, this painting doesn't really belong in this talk, but the idea of it does. The idea of it is that you see, biologists see things one way and indigenous people see them another way. And a beautiful example of this is this particular artist from, I think she's from Victoria in Canada, and she makes these paintings with comparing the animal itself with the quaquiudal imagination of that particular animal, and it's very much a what do you say, every natural fact is a every natural fact is a symbol. Let's just leave it at that. A spiritual symbol. That's the way it goes. Every natural fact is a spiritual symbol, and I'm very much a believer in that. So this is my talk. Peoples of the Annamites, multiple versions of the same place, because every ethnic group, and there are many, has a different version. They see something different in the Annamites, and the Annamites is such an incredibly diverse area, both from the point of view of biology and from the point of view of ethnicity. So it goes well together. I don't think there's any other place in Laos or maybe even in Southeast Asia that can compare with it. Now, this was given to me by Camille. I asked her if she had a definition of the Annamites, and this is something that seems to be very tricky for people to do, is to define it. And maybe Bill has some ideas as well, since he's worked there so much. But for me, going south from the northernmost point of the green hatching there makes sense. But then going north, I can't see where there's a natural cutoff point. And I'm not sure whether this is because the people who have defined the Annamites are primarily biologists or something else. And maybe somebody knows, I don't know. But I've extended this, since we're talking about human ethnic diversity, I've extended this line, with this red line. It actually should be cross-hatching as well, because on the right-hand side of this line, on the eastern side, this is a watershed divide, so that the rivers on the eastern side of this line flow into the South China Sea, and on the other side they flow into the Mekong. So it's a fairly important distinction, and it's really just an extension of the Annamites as far as I can see, and I don't understand why we stop at the place that it stops here. So I'm going to, in the interests of diversity, I'm going to include this. I'm not going to spend much time on that northern part because we just don't have that much time. There are too many ethnic groups to talk about. But the northern part of this, with the extension of this northern part, that means that all 5 ethno-linguistic families are found in the Annamites. All 5, that is, all 5 ethno-linguistic families that occur in mainland Southeast Asia occur in the Annamites, which gives you an idea of the diversity. This includes Burma, it includes Thailand, Vietnam, Cambodia. So that's a fairly impressive statement already. Now, the Annamites, the word Annam, of course, comes from probably was devised by the French for because it's Annam, right? The French in French Indochina, Vietnam was divided into three separate states: Tonkin and Annam and Cochin China in the very far south. So that central part is called Annam. But in fact, going even further back, Annam, as you can see here, with the in fact included all of what is now North Vietnam, everything south of. But there was no border, of course, in those days. But if we imagine that there was a Chinese-Vietnamese border, it would be the part that's south of that border. Now, this area was in China was called Lingyang, meaning south of the passes, and this includes modern day Guangdong and Guangxi primarily. And then as soon as you get south of Guangxi and Guangdong, you're in Annam. So it makes sense for this part of the border, that red part that we just saw, would be included as well. Anyway, just a suggestion. I don't know if there are or were ever any Saola in the area, but it's that northern part is probably more heavily populated and therefore not so good for conservation. So these are the ethno-linguistic families going from north to south. The very far northern part of that are mainly Tibeto-Burman speakers. Then there are Hmong Mien, beginning in Huapeng and then going all the way down, as you know, all the way down to Nakai, at least to the edges of it. Gradai or Tai Gadai. Interspersed then with Austroasiatic and Austronesian. Austroasiatic is probably the most abundant of all the different peoples in that area. But interspersed with Austroasiatic are these Thai groups. Normally the Thai groups are in the lowland valleys along the edges of the Animites, and the Austroasiatic people are in the hills, but not always. You know, that's a conditional statement. So starting with Tibeto-Burman, there are essentially two groups along that red line, Bisoid or Bisu, which includes the Punoi groups. Punoi is probably the most influential and largest of the groups, ethnic groups in Gom Sa Li province in Laos, which borders on Vietnam. And Bika, which includes the languages that Nate Badnock, who's here with us today, has studied extensively, Baza and Muji, Sida, Ke, and another one called Bana. But Tibeto-Burman is huge. As you can see, it's just a little tiny part of it reaches Laos, but the family itself is gigantic, includes all of Tibet and large parts of China. These are some old photos. I tried to use old photos where I can find them just for interest. Most of the Punois today are rather acidified, and so they probably wouldn't like to imagine themselves in this kind of dress. But in fact, that was the way it was when the French first arrived in Indochina. These were some Punoi girls, and yes, you don't see this anymore. as far as I know. This is Baza or Pusang. Nate has studied this particular language extensively. And the traditional dress is very colorful, as you can see. So I'm going to move, as I take you along, I'm going to move from north to south. So the next ethnic group going south that we come across, and excuse me, I'm not going to, I'll mention the Austroasiatic groups later altogether, because you can't, it's not discrete in terms of which groups occur where. The Hmong people that are found in this, along that red line, for example, are mainly white Hmong, and there's a little small group of black Hmong as well. The Hmong are, of course, as you can see in the photo here, great producers of poppies, and they still do this, and they still do it on the outskirts of Nakai. And many of the ethnic groups that we'll talk about today have become more or less addicted to opium because of the sad situation, which I will describe later, that they find themselves in. And finally, the last group, Yumian, there are just one or two villages in the Huapan province where this group would live in the vicinity of that red line. So I'm not going to go into any of this in detail. That's a Black Hmong family. The Hmong Mian family was very widespread, as you can say, but mostly in upland areas across southern China. The blue are Mian and the red are Hmong. And you can see they come here very far south into Laos, right into Kamgut district, which is next to the protected area. Now, Austroasiatic has many branches. It's a huge group, ethno-linguistic group, a stock perhaps would be the better term. Includes Brahmic, which are the languages that, another group of languages that Nate has worked with extensively. And they would actually almost be in the green hatching area of that map, in the tip top of the northern part of it, because I think it's Ponglan, if I'm not mistaken. In the far eastern part of Xianquang province, and potentially on the Vietnamese side as well, although I don't know that for a fact. Khmuic, again, not so populous, but a fair number in Samui province and on the Vietnamese side as well. But in the vicinity of the red line, not so much. Formerly what was called the Vietic group, I've renamed this group Kri Mol based on languages that we discovered and found throughout Nakai. But a lot of people probably don't agree with this, so I have to watch my step. I'll try to call it Vietic just for to simplify things. It's a big group when you include Vietnamese, but it's not so big when you don't include Vietnamese. Then moving south, Katuic, the Bru, those people, those of you who have worked in Nakai, for example, and adjacent areas are familiar with Bro, belongs to the Katuic family, or Katuic branch of Mon Khmer, I should say. And finally, further south, Banarik. Unfortunately, there's so many members of each of these branches that I can't possibly mention them all. It's just a tribute to the ethnic diversity that exists throughout the Annamites. Here you can see the whole ethno-linguistic family or stock that we call Austroasiatic. Some people still call it Mon Khmer. And it's, as you can see, it's huge. Here it goes from way over here where we're interested along the Animites down to, the middle of Malaysia, and then including the Nicobar Islands, and then way over here in India, even to there's a language called Korku here in the far west central India. But it's quite startling when you see this. This map was prepared by Gérard Deflotte, who was one of the world's leading, probably the world's leading expert on Mon Khmer or Austroasiatic languages. Now, so to take to look in detail at the branches, Creole or Vietic is quite unusual as a group of languages or as a group of people because it includes so many cultural types. I've called them eco-spatial types here, but in fact, cultural types would be just as good a term. And it goes from what we call a small group foraging nomads that I'll show you some pictures of in a minute, which include these languages: Atop, Atel, Temeru, Lengbu, Dut, and then there are sort of in-between groups who are starting to become Swidden cultivators, but are not fully developed Swidden cultivators. And they also are kind of middlemen between the people on the inner deep forest areas and the people outside. So a lot of this that I'm telling you now is the way it used to be. In the meantime, the government has rounded up most of the deep forest hunter-gatherers and put them in villages where they have not done very well, as I will show you. Unfortunately, it's a sad story. But here you can see the different groups that fall into this cultural type 2. Cultural type 3 is unusual. It's Gri, and this, as you can see, they move traditionally, at any rate, they moved their villages rather than moving their fields. So they move their villages to be with the field every 2 or 3 years. It's sort of, instead of rotational cultivation, it was rotational villages. And these were pre-existing sites, so they knew where they were going to at each step of the way. And finally, the combined Swidden and Paddy sedentary people There are these of course would include the Vietnamese themselves, and of course we would have to add on to that the city people who live in Hanoi and other big cities in Vietnam, who are very distant in terms of cultural type from the groups that you see here. But look at the diversity of this group. We have called it the Vieto-Katuic group because there seems to be a relationship between the Katuic branch and the Vietic branch, but the Creole side of this, we'll talk about the Katuic separately, includes these two main divisions, and then a set of 4 kind of subdivisions. The groups that are in red fonts are hunter-gatherers, and so each one of these, of the 4 subdivisions, 3 of them have hunter-gatherers. But you can see just the sheer number in a very small area of these groups. It's quite astonishing, actually. Now, if you go back and look at this family tree, Tum, Pong, and Liha form a subgroup. This is a Pong man on the left and a Tum woman on the right. This village where this picture was taken, I think Bill probably knows well, was one of the villages that one of the first Saola was captured and sent to the zoo in Lac Sao. It was from this particular village. So these people live basically along the edge of but on the Lao side, but along the edge of the Vu Quang Reserve on the Vietnamese side, where the Saola was found. The territory, I always like to make the distinction between the map and the territory, but so here's an attempt to map the territory. But you can see that the people themselves divide the territory in certain ways, and these are all the different territories that they have used for their own. There's one missing here called Atak Group, which is where the Temeru live. Because at the time we did this map, we didn't know the name of that territory. And this is where you find in this area of Vietic speakers, other ethnic groups like Bru are mainly in this central part and slightly southern part of Nak Gai Nam Tun, the protected area, what is now, I guess, a national park, right? And then the other groups are Vietic. They're very diverse. In historical linguistic terms, the areas that have the greatest diversity in the smallest area are considered to be the oldest. And I'll show you at the end how this seems to be true for this area. This, Bill knows well, is the kind of the gateway to the Atel land. Atel is one of the ethnic groups. They're hunter-gatherers, or they used to be. This waterfall, Hoi Canil, the Canil stream, marks the boundary between the Atel who live above this and the Makang who live below it. The Makang are a difficult group to classify, but they're it's in terms of cultural type. But I assume they're mostly hunter-gatherers, but they also seem to be more outgoing in terms of contacts with the outside world. So I don't know where to put those from an anthropological perspective. At any rate, the Atel and the Makang can intermarry. That's one of the interesting things about them, and they have adjacent territories. On top of the waterfall, this is what it looks like. Our very good friend, Mr. Tui, can be seen here walking along the Huaycanil, his home. So from here, these people were relocated to this village called Chamberlain. They have, at the time this picture was taken, they had been there almost 20 years. And the purpose of the relocation, of course, was always described as, well, they need to become civilized and they need to become, they know what it's like to live in a village. And so after 20 years, this is how far they've gotten. It's kind of sad. This is another one of their homes. Now, these doles have a particular role in the life or the original lifestyle of the Atel people. They actually don't do much hunting themselves. They rely on the doles to make a kill of a deer or a sirah or a sambar or something. And then the Atel people come along and chase the dogs away. The dogs are quite shy, and then share the meat from the kill. So they actually don't kill the animals themselves in this case. That's not to say they don't actually hunt. They do, but this is their main source of protein. There is a myth. These are, of course, taboo animals. You can't hunt or kill the doles, and also the crow. Interestingly enough, so there's a myth that we collected about the dole and the crow. The crows, basically, the crows were responsible for, making a lot of noise when the kills were made and running around with pieces of meat in their mouth. And so it kind of gave a sign to the people where the kill was. And so they could follow the crow to find out where the kill had been made. This is a Makang woman. She was, when we met her, she was quite energetic, and in fact, this is a resettled area. They had resettled into this area called Nam Hoi, and she I remember when we were first interviewing her that she came in, and actually we were talking to the village chief, and she came in and plopped herself down between us and the village chief, turned her back on the village chief, and then said, "If you have anything to talk about, talk to me." And so she was quite a character. These are the resettled villages all in a row. Then finally moving on from that group of hunter-gatherers to the valley of the Nam Tun. These other groups were in the valley of the Nam Sot. And you can see here the original clothing worn. This is not a. This is clothing that was either not being used or was made for the purpose of taking the pictures. I'm not sure yet. I'm suspicious because General Zheng was behind it, and he wanted to use the people as to attract people to his department store in Laksao. So he had them walk around in this dress. This is bark cloth. Bark cloth is made from, but people did wear bark cloth, and it's made from the bark of a very poisonous tree. And the outer bark can be soaked and used as and pounded and used as cloth. In fact, that was the only cloth at the time. But when it dries out, it gets very hard and crusty. So this is unfortunately the dried out version. The inner bark, by the way, of that same tree is used to poison the tips of crossbow arrows. Now, an interesting thing about the hunter-gatherers in Nakai is that they don't use crossbows. Other cultural types do, but not the hunter-gatherers. It's very unusual. So there are no projectile weapons or hunting implements used. Their whole culture is bamboo, and they don't need anything. It's a nightmare for archaeologists who are trying to figure out what to do, because you can't dig up the ashes of bamboo. You could, I suppose, if you knew where they were, but if you want to, traipse through the rainforest and try to find a place where there once was a fire 1,000 years ago, it's pretty hard for archaeologists. When we first met this group called Tamaru, this was their idea of a house, because they don't really stay in any one place permanently. They roam. This particular group roams in a cycle through the middle part of the Nakai protected area, the upper middle part, and so they never stay in one place more than a couple days at most. And this is the kind of shelter that they build. So when they were brought into this village to live in this village, which was a Bru village, they were told that they had to make houses, and of course they didn't know what to do. And so this is the kind of house that they made. This is the family of the man who lives here. He was just a delightful person. I talked to him for many hours over the years, and I keep coming back, and he's still there. I don't know if he's still there now, because I haven't been back there in so many years, but he was an incredible source of information. This is after they had moved from this style of house and they had learned how to build the more permanent style of house here. And these women, you can see that their stature is quite small. They're never more than 5 feet for sure. And as you can see, but their population, they all have children. The population between one 10-year period, since I first visited and the last time I visited, was had stayed pretty much the same at 43 people. So I don't know, that may be a possibility for survival of this particular group. They still speak the language. I'm sorry, this is out of sequence. These belong back along the groups of the Nam Sot. This is one of the places that they put the people next to a Sak village called Nakadok. Sak is another ethnic group I'll mention in a minute. And you can see from their facial expressions, they're all kind of despondent because they don't really enjoy being where they are, and they're not being allowed to move. So I don't know what their situation is now. I haven't been back there in many years. And so I hesitate to even think about what their situation may be like. Bill may have been back since then. I haven't. These are the kids. They were just living like this because parents don't know how to raise kids in a village type of environment. This is yet another person, another group called Atop, from very far upper reaches of the Memsot River. And they're in a separate location called Bonkut. Again, living next to a Thai village where they were put by the government. Now, moving into this gray kind of cultural type, this is on yet another river valley called the Nam Noi. This was there were three villages at the time, the northern, central, and southern villages called Ban Maka, and this is the southern one. You can see the houses are made with the caw palm is a kind of a palm tree that they use to make the roofing of houses and other things as well, including the house of the hunter-gatherers that we just saw. This is a closer up view of I think this is in the northern Panamaka at the time. This small house here is for menstruating women. They stay in this house while they're menstruating, and then they are taken care of by their husbands who bring them food and whatever they need while they're there. These are young girls considered to be, when they wear a white shirt, that's the symbol that they are of marriageable age. So you can see how young they are when people get married. Moving over to the next river valley, going south, this is the Nam On. We tried to visit this place at the same time in 1996, but oops, the helicopter that we were in was unable to land on this. We thought we'd be able to land here, and he tried very hard, but in the end he said, no, I can't do it. So, and it turned out that the people were there and had seen us, but were hiding in the trees. So in the meantime, they moved over this escarpment. This is the Ak escarpment on the southern side of the plateau. And so they had moved off the plateau here. I'm quite sure they were told to move. And they, at first they moved about halfway down to this location. There weren't very many people. The last time I visited them, eventually they moved all the way down to the side of the road on, my goodness. I've got to hurry up. Next to a Yoi village. The last time I saw them, there were only 12 people left who could speak this language. So I don't know what their situation is at the present time. This was the old matriarch. She had a great sense of humor. Katuic, boy, I'm really going to run out of time. Katuic groups include Bru, Bakoh, Taoy, Katu. Saola, people may remember that Taoy and Katu were two languages where there were separate terms for the Saola. that were found. Saola itself, of course, comes from Nean. The Duic languages are spread out like this and include 3 groups. I'm going to give you an example. This is blue. But this is the blue found in Vientiane in northeastern Sedentary province. Okay, I'll keep moving on. Blue has an extremely complex cosmology, and I won't try to describe it in the time we have left because it's too complicated, but it's very, very interesting and very understudied, as are most of these groups. This is Bakoh. Bakoh, in some places, still have longhouses like this. It's not something you see very much anymore. This is a group called Gado, living next, sort of east of the Taoi. This is a Taoi woman. This is Dakjin in, I don't know how I got here. Okay. Anyway, the Tu itself was a very well organized group originally. And this is one of their villages as it used to be. In the center is a community, a communal house, which is very important for carrying out various rituals and festivities. And this is from another village. They build these very elaborate coffins. The first thing that married people do when they first get married is build a coffin. And they keep the coffin under the house, so under all the houses you see coffins, very elaborate in some cases, such as you see here. They do weaving. This is the old backstrap method of weaving without a loom, but it's very colorful. Finally, Benarik, moving farther south, 3 big groups of Benarik, 4 I should say, and then they're very religious Swidden cultivators. You can see the man on the right there with the dibble stick poking holes in the ground, and after he pokes the hole, the women come along and put the rice grains in the holes. Most of these Benarik groups have heirlooms, and one of the most precious of the heirlooms are these wine jars, very elaborate wine jars, which I guess they must get from Vietnam, but they're handed down from generation to generation, and they've been in the house a long time. This is a Sadang girl who doing some weaving. She's weaving on a loom, actually. Finally, this is courtesy of Ian Baird, who did a lot of work with the Brau people, and was one of the first ones that I know of who actually pointed out the differences between subgroups of Brau. As you can see here, there are many. Getting down to Austronesian, this is of course another one of those very large groups geographically, and you can see here this very small area here are Chamic people, and their houses look like this. This is a Vade or Ade house. This is a Jarai house, or maybe I've got them reversed, I'm not sure. I don't know these people very well. I just know of them, and know that they're there. Finally, the last group that we haven't talked about are Tai Kadai, which include Lao, but include many, many other groups. Just in Kamkut alone, there are more than 20 different varieties of Thai. They normally prefer to live in this sort of situation, valleys in between mountains. So they're still very much part of the Annamites. The other group that nobody knows very well are the Sac. And the Sac, even though they're very high up, living near the Cree, actually, they insist on doing paddy cultivation, and so they have very elaborate systems of irrigation that they have set up. Okay, finally, I'm going to delve off into a favorite topic of mine. This is a great mystery that very few people know about, but the word, and I first ran across it because I noticed that the word for snake in the Temeru language, which is Kobuet, sorry, I have to spell it like, oops, with the W because I didn't have the IPA on this computer. Kobuet was the word for snake, and it seems that it's the same word as found in Chiamao, which is on Hainan Island, which is that's actually an imploded bee, and then all across Oceania, especially the Marianas, and then into the area that archaeologists describe as being Lapita, which is the eastern part of Oceania. It includes the Solomons and Samoa and others. So this is the same, essentially the same word for a linguist. So it has this huge area from here where we are in the Annamites all the way across the Pacific to Micronesia and Oceania. Enormous expanse. So it's a mystery. How did this happen? What happened? How did it start? We don't know. But if we go back to the mainland, we find that in these other languages, Bui and Green Gulau and Beep that Nate has worked with, and Temeru down here, and Tiamau here, they all have words that correspond to that one. Then, to make matters even more interesting, each of these groups, which represent a river valley, this is the Nam Sot, this is the Nam Tun, this is the Nam Noi, and this originally was the Nam On, have separate words for snake, which are not related to that one. And so you find these, and all of them are related to Austronesian languages. So it's a huge mystery how they got there. I won't go into it any more than that because but it's a fascinating thing. Why have these words been preserved in these river valleys at a time depth that is probably something like 4,000 years in the same area. So it just boggles the mind to think about this very humble little person and that guy preserving all of this history that nobody really understands. And it's just a really good example of the kind of diversity that exists in the Annamites and the kinds of mysteries that still exist in this area. So I'm going to have to stop here. I'm way over time. Thank you. I'd be very happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Jim. That was awesome. Very, very interesting. We did get quite a number of questions, so I guess we'll just dive right into them.
Okay.
First question was from Jane. How well can the different groups communicate with each other, and how do you explain the persistence of all these languages?
That's a very good question, a very interesting question. Of course, they've been living alongside each other for a long time, and they're not living in isolation, and so they need to communicate for whatever reason, and they do. And sometimes they can intermarry, and sometimes they can't. It depends upon the traditions and the customs of that particular ethnic group. The persistence of the languages is extremely interesting, and it's like maybe it's the only thing they have left. Everything else has been taken away from them, but at least they have that kind of agency where they've been able to preserve their language. How many of them have gone through periods of language change or language shift? I can't tell you, because we haven't been able. The only way to understand these kinds of issues is to go and live there and learn to speak the language of the group, or if possible, many groups. And this I have to, my good friend Nate Badenoch has done this in other parts of Laos, and has just come up with amazing insights into what's going on in this precisely this kind of situation. So the only way to answer these questions is to go there and live and see what people are doing on the ground. It can't be done from the air.
Okay, thank you. Next question is from Joaquin. I apologize if I am butchering your name. Do most of these groups farm, and which crops do they cultivate besides rice?
Well, of course, the hunter-gatherers don't farm at all. That's their thing. Hunting and gathering means you have no agriculture. So the other groups, I went through it quite fast, but they mostly cultivate swidden fields. That means that it's dry rice. It's not wet rice. The farms are on the slopes of mountains. They poke holes in the ground with the sticks and put the rice in there, and then they have to cut down that piece of forest where they're going to plant, and then burn it, and then plant, and then harvest, and then move on the next year to a new location. In the meantime, that forest, this is part of the issue that people don't understand. That part of the forest that was cut down then regenerates, because people don't come back to it and for maybe 10 or 15 years. And so that forest regenerates, and as it regenerates in different types of forests, depending upon the number of years that the fallow period has been there. So those types of fallow areas and those types of different types of forests then create new environments for different types of birds, and it enhances biodiversity. In fact, most of the ungulates and those other animals couldn't exist, and they really can't exist in a deep rainforest because there's nothing to eat on the ground, and most of the food is in the trees. So the swidden cultivation is in fact an ecologically sound way of preserving biodiversity.
Thank you. Next question from Ben. How many of these groups have mapped their traditional territories? Which organizations or agencies are supporting territorial mapping? And is there an effort to coordinate such efforts to advance land claims in the Annamites?
Things have not, at least as of the last time that I worked there, and I suspect that hasn't changed that much in that respect. That sort of, the territories were recognized by themselves and other groups. They were not officially recognized by the government, and they had no land certificates or anything like that. And it's probably better that they don't, because this way it actually works. If you try to survey and map, then you immediately run into problems. I don't think that's going to happen. It has happened on the plateau because of the resettlement associated with the Mountain 2 Dam. But in other areas of the country, like Hinam Nal, for example, just to the south, and Cumberland Limestone to the west, this has not happened either. And I don't think that in those areas, it's very difficult to map upland areas meaningfully in terms of land use planning and that kind of thing. If you've ever tried to figure out on a slope the number of hectares in a field, then you'll know what the problem is. It's very, very difficult. And governments, of course, like to measure rice production in terms of yield per hectare, but people in the upland areas never do that. They only measure yield per unit of labor, so that you can figure out how much rice an individual has been responsible for, but not a unit of land. Governments like it because it's easy, but it only works for lowland paddy rice agriculture. It doesn't work for upland swidden cultivation.
Okay, thanks. Next question from Karina. Do young men leave the group when they become adults and join other groups?
I'm sure it depends upon the groups themselves, and where they are in relation to other groups, and whether that is an option, given the way that they were brought up and lived the early part of their lives. It's possible, and no doubt happens all the time, but I don't think it's really been studied that carefully. It would be interesting to know.
Okay, Nathan actually flagged one of these questions as extra important, so we'll ask that one next. What about writing systems? How many are there, and do they interrelate?
For most of the people that we've just been talking about, and the Annamites, with the exception of the Thai speakers, there are no indigenous writing systems for their languages. In some cases, for example, Bru linguists have gone in to study the language and created writing systems for them, either using Lao script or Thai script or Roman script. But it's not something that is important to most people. For the Thai speakers, however, there are many different kinds of alphabets, and they're usually related to each other. The ones in the Annamites are related to each other, like Red Thai and Thai Tang and those groups. But they're not being used in the education system, for example. Schools insist on only writing Lao script, regardless of the language that you speak.
Okay, shout out to Ian as well for answering some of the questions in chat. Thanks a lot. There were a couple questions about other groups. Eleanor was asking about the Lisu, and Tim was asking about the Salang Aram or Aram and Tree, TRI.
Yeah.
Both asking where these groups fit in.
Well, of course, Lisu is a long way over in northern Thailand, so that doesn't really fit into the Annamites. But the three, there's a Bru was actually a big category, and there within the Bru there are three and Makong and So and other groups, and it even gets more complicated than that. And so they are groups that are related to each other very closely, but not always mutually intelligible. Depends upon the particular kind of tree or brew. We've run into cases where the Makong are actually calling themselves Makong, and their culture is Makong, but their language is Tri. So it makes it very difficult unless you are skilled enough to understand the differences. The Bru languages are quite complicated because of the vowel system. Most of the languages have, on the average, maybe 45 vowels. This makes it very difficult to differentiate.
All right, I think we'll do one more. Jane asks, did these groups fight amongst themselves like some of the First Nations in North and South America?
Not that I'm aware of. There seems to have been, at least in most of the Annamites, there hasn't been much of a hierarchy. The ones in the South, the Monaric groups, I think probably did. And some of them, in fact, made raids into Vietnam and captured Vietnamese people to sell to Thailand as slaves in the 19th century. So there was a certain amount of violence there. But with all of the other branches of Austroasiatic, that doesn't seem to have been an issue. Probably with the Austronesians as well, perhaps. But where we're talking about in Saola territory, hardly any at all.
Okay, thanks very much. I guess we will wrap it up there. As Bill said before, if people want to stick around and chat some more, that's fine, but I'm going to stop the recording here. So anything from this point on is informal. For those of you whose questions we didn't get to, we have recorded the questions, and hopefully we'll get Jim to reach out to you via email.
Sure.
Thanks again.
Yeah, I'll stick around in case anybody has any extra time.
And I'll just